Good evening, guys. Welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. Our speaker is Gwen Ngwenya, former MP, former head of policy for the Democratic Alliance. She was also a student at the University of Cape Town. She holds a degree from UCT. She was also the SRC president during her time here. She has a master's in international economics, if I'm correct.
Mm-hmm.
And she's currently completing her master's in finance at the University of London. Previously, she was the youngest member of parliament, but now I think someone else has taken that title from her. It's someone else now. Anyway, without further ado, Gwen.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you for having me here. I'm going to try to be brief, but I said the exact same thing last night at Stellenbosch, and I don't think I was brief, so don't hold me to that. But I do especially want to try and give time for questions and answers at the end, so I will do my best. So essentially today, what we're here to really explore is the fact that in South Africa we talk a great deal about events that involve race, but I don't feel we spend or devote the same amount of attention in interrogating the arguments that rely on race or the ideas that rely on race in South Africa. So whilst this talk is about South Africa after race, I'll spend most of the time talking about the arguments that are used to prop up race in society and in policy, and work backwards, so to talk about those ideas, and then also to work backwards to see how these particular arguments, in fact, undermine particular ideals of what South Africa could be in the future. When I talk about the myth of race specifically, I'm just referring to the fact that the way in which we use race in our social and political interactions has a weak scientific basis, but obviously it is a construct that does exist. And I want to explore how this idea of race, while still being false, in fact operates quite powerfully but detrimentally in society. As I say, I'll explore these falsehoods by actually first highlighting a statement of an ideal and then explaining how the myth of race undermines that particular ideal. So ideal number one is that in a society without race, we would live in a country that is a meritocracy. And what I mean by that is that we would live in a society in which merit is highly valued, or rather where achievement is highly valued. And in certain cases, for example, in selection processes, it would be so highly valued that it could only be trumped in the most exceptional of circumstances or with the most exceptional considerations. That's not to say that we conceive of a society in which merit is kind of this absolutist idea with absolutely no exceptions. As I said, it could be trumped, but with more considered or exceptional circumstances. And indeed, I think as just a kind of side issue, there's a very good book about a kind of dystopian society in which everybody gets exactly what they deserve. And it's actually written by, I think he's a gentleman who founded the term meritocracy, Michael Young, who was a British sociologist. Just sort of as an aside, that's quite an interesting book to read about kind of the pitfalls of a purely meritocratic society. But nonetheless, talking about a society in which merit is valued to a great extent. And I want to explore how race then might undermine this particular value. So I'm going to explore this in two separate ways. So I'm going to look at the argument that is used mostly by those who are liberals or liberal parties, and then I'm going to explore, on the other hand, how it discounts merit as it actually applies in terms of the policies that are in place by the governing party. So the first scenario that is used by liberals is kind of this two equally competent candidates hypothesis. So the Democratic Alliance, and I'd say those who are more of a liberal persuasion, but who yet still buy into race-based policy, are prone to saying that, yes, we will use race, but kind of only as this trump card. In a scenario where we have two equally competent candidates, we will use race to give preference to the black candidates where two candidates are equally competent. The trouble with this particular scenario is twofold. The first is that it's actually quite a fantastical scenario. And I say this because, just anecdotally, having been involved in hiring processes myself, I think that this scenario very rarely ever occurs, where two individuals are so identical that you really, no matter what you do, cannot tell them apart. And the only differentiating factor between them is the fact that one candidate is black and one candidate is white. This is highly unlikely. So one, even if the scenario were to arise, I would posit that it would arise in so few circumstances as to virtually be really futile as a way of guiding policy decisions, because you would very rarely come across this particular scenario. So it wouldn't help you in policy for the majority of the time. But also what's problematic is the fact that when you have equally qualified candidates, let's say race wasn't a criteria, there would be an incentive to in fact probe further and find more substantive reasons for why the candidates are truly different. So as an example, most job descriptions I'll say job descriptions that go out for particular jobs or roles will highlight perhaps, minimum criteria in which every applicant needs to meet. For this discussion, let's just say that the two criteria is that the candidate that a particular company is looking for has a master's degree in a particular subject and also has 5 years experience. Let's say that's the minimum criteria. Normally, there will be many people who in fact meet this minimum criteria. What then happens is that institutions must then look through, psychometric testing, through interviews, through many other ways. You'll then be able to tease out other ways in which these candidates will be different. And you'll find that perhaps whilst all of these candidates may have a master's degree and 5 years experience, there might be some among them who've had international experience, and maybe you think that that's useful. Or there might be those who've worked in particular kind of geographic zones that you think that kind of experience would do well for your company, or who have a more diversified background in terms of the subject areas in which they have worked in. But the point is, you will find substantive indicators that make one candidate better than the other. What happens, however, when you have race as a trump card is that you don't engage in this probing investigation for other substantive factors that might distinguish candidates. The moment you have two candidates that both meet this kind of minimal criteria, you immediately then exercise race as the trump card and say, well, we now have a black candidate who has a master's degree and 5 years experience, and they're black, therefore they get the job. So what you've done there is that actually race-based policy has the effect of ensuring that the candidate who meets the minimum qualifications and also happens to be black is the likely person who always gets the job. It is not, in fact, the person who's the best candidate. Now, there's a huge difference between the best candidate and the candidate who meets the minimal criteria to do the job. And if we're talking about merit, as I previously started off with, it's a society in which achievement and excellence is highly valued, not necessarily minimum criteria. So in terms of the liberal conception of the two equally qualified candidates, these are the two ways in which that argument falls short. If I now explore the policies that are put in place by the governing party in terms of employment equity policies, let's say, and BE policies, the trouble there is really in how the Employment Equity Act defines or conceives of suitably qualified individuals who come from designated groups. Now, the E Act kind of promotes or it urges employers, perhaps I'm being too generous in that language there, it's probably a lot more forceful than that, but employers must in fact submit an employment equity plan that will ensure over time the equitable representation of suitably qualified people from designated groups. But as I say, the rub is how you in fact define what is suitably qualified. And the Employment Equity Act defines suitably qualified as individuals who meet the formal qualifications, who have prior learning experience, relevant experience, but also fourthly, the capacity to acquire within a reasonable time frame the ability to do the job. In other words, candidates who show potential that they might be able to fulfill the job. Now, this is the criteria that explicitly discounts merit, because many people in life have the capacity to do a whole range of things. We all have the potential possibly to do a whole range of things. The real issue is whether we will live up to that particular potential or capacity. Now, businesses and institutions make judgment calls on potential all the time. That's not necessarily codified in law. When an investor chooses to invest in a particularly small company, he takes that risk and says, I think there's potential here that this will generate me a reward. And I think if I, take this risk, there might potentially be a big upside. But again, if he's wrong about the potential of that business, he will lose out. And any amount of money he's invested might be lost. Now, the problem with codifying potential in hiring practices is the fact that it undermines freedom by, in fact, forcing companies, public institutions to engage in a transaction, in which case the transaction is employing somebody, which the government has no intention to underwrite. So governments will not compensate institutions or employers who hire people on the basis of this capacity to one day be able to do the job if in fact that person does not live up to their capacity. And as we see in many municipalities and public institutions around the country, there are many people who in fact are not fit for the job in which they are employed. So hiring based on potential is something that should be really a judgment call of that particular company or institutions. It's a voluntary thing, and it's associated with a high degree of risk. It's not something that the government should mandate, unless, of course, as I say, it might be reasonable if the government was willing to underwrite that particular risk and say, well, if you incur any losses by engaging in this practice, if this person doesn't in fact turn out to have the capacity, meet or rise up to their potential capacity, we will compensate you for this disastrous policy. That's not in fact how it operates. So just to conclude that first ideal of a meritocratic society, we're saying that race-based policy undermines this idea of merit, firstly by removing any incentive to probe into an investigation that might really select the most meritocratic candidate, because the moment a black candidate meets minimum criteria, race is used as a trump card. So there's no reason to investigate further and see whether there's actually any other criteria that might set two potential candidates apart. Secondly, if we're looking at EE and BE policy, the failure there is that really it's this forced transaction, which, as I say, potential incurs a high degree of risk, and the government has no intention to underwrite it. The second ideal that I want to move to about what a society that doesn't have race would look like is this idea that it would be a society that is far more socially stable. Now, the irony is that most race-based policy is put in place precisely because there's this belief that race-based policy will help us achieve a society in which there's better race relations, that's far more socially stable than it currently is. But if we refer back to what we've just been talking about how race in fact discounts merit, then we can see that the likelihood is that actually instead of exposing people in the workplace to people of different races who are equally competent, which is the idea, is that you run the risk, in fact, of having these policies that enable people who do not have the qualifications for the job to, in fact, be in those positions. And so people are exposed to people who can't do the job. And the more people are exposed to people who can't do the job, it in fact reinforces the harmful stereotypes that black people are incompetent and can't do the job. So actually it achieves the exact opposite of saying that you're going to have these race-based policies to increase competent black people in the workplace in order to remove stereotypes. You don't remove the stereotypes, you actually enforce them. Another element that I suppose is quite important when we discuss political stability or social stability and social relations is this idea that race consciousness fundamentally heightens race sensitivity. So one theorist defined race consciousness as the tendency towards sentimental and ideological identification with one's racial group. So for those who are individually race conscious, the race becomes kind of this object of loyalty, devotion, and pride. And some may say, well, surely this is okay. But the problem with, even if we're talking about self-classification, which the racial identity starts first on an individual basis, it very soon becomes actually a collective identity because there are many people who share that particular skin color if you're in a society in which race is predominantly based on skin color. So what we see quite early on is that this race consciousness often becomes race pride. So we see members of that particular group relishing the achievements of other members of that group. And it makes sense because you gain kind of vicarious status by those people who are part of that group. And particularly in groups in which in the past they have been oppressed or have enjoyed some kind of minority in terms of their political and economic influence, having these kind of vicarious status symbols in society enables them in a way to ameliorate their complex and to say, look, actually, here are examples of competent or excelling black people. Therefore, we are capable of excelling and doing well. But the problem with this kind of vicarious pride or vicarious status, and we see it even now in modern times quite, if you look on social media, I often see this hashtag Black excellence and people taking pride in the achievement of other Black people as though it was their own personal achievement. The problem with that is that if one can have pride in their racial group, obviously the reverse can also happen. There's also then shame in that racial group. So when a Black person is criticized or attacked, people who are part of the group feel as though they are being personally criticized or attacked. And quite recently, the journalist and former editor Songezo Zibi wrote in News 24 this article that was actually highly praised amongst quite a number of public commentators. And this article was titled, "Recover Blackness Butchered During Zuma Years." And he essentially, briefly, he just writes about the fact that Black people, in a way, have been silent about the corruption that has happened during the Zuma years, precisely because of this problem, that many Black people felt they could not criticize a Black government because to do so was to point out something incompetent about themselves. And he actually urges, unfortunately, whilst I agree with this kind of diagnosis, he then reaches, I think, a false conclusion. So he says the problem with this is the corrupt political elite. And he says that there are actually many excellent Black people that we can look to, and it's these people that we should try and support, etc., and not feel like we need to support these incompetent people who are in fact anti-Black, these incompetent, corrupt people who are in fact anti-Black. But the problem with this is that even taking pride in those Black people who are excellent engages in the same kind of race identitarianism or race association with the racial group, which is actually harmful. So the same feelings that give rise to racial pride actually are the same feelings that give rise to racial shame and feeling as though one has to answer for the actions of one's particular group. And this race essentialism is prevalent throughout society. And we see it even, for example, it might be worth reading out a quote by the leader of the opposition who said, for every incident, and that's Musi Maimane, for every incident of overt racism, there are thousands of incidences of casual, everyday racism. It manifests itself in simple ways like talking down to people, laughing when people pronounce an English word differently, not bothering to acknowledge people, in fact, believing somebody's accent is a sign of their intelligence. These are all subtle forms of racial superiority. Now, this is what I think racial hypersensitivity does. It makes us racially suspicious of one another. The reality is that there are a range of attitudes in ordinary human interactions. People can be sarcastic with each other, patronizing, rude, mocking, etc. None of these things necessarily means the person is racist, although these interactions may be unpleasant. And so what race consciousness does is it actually robs us of the dynamism that actually exists in normal human interactions, and it reduces almost every negative human experience down to one of being a racial or a racist experience, when that is not the case. What is true is that a society that discounts race, so the society that I'm talking about that is less socially conscious or less hyper-aware of race, might also be a society that discounts racism when it does legitimately occur. But if we concede or if we accept that the majority of people are not racist, it might be different if you of the point of view the majority of, let's say, white South Africans are racist. But if we take the view the majority of white South Africans are not racist, then I think it is far more preferable that some cases, a small limited number of cases that might be legitimate racism are misdiagnosed as something else, than rather for the wider range of many human interactions to all of them be diagnosed as instances of racism. So I'll just repeat that again because I think it's quite an important point, but might be a bit complex, just that it's far preferable for this minority of cases which might be legitimate racist incidences to not in fact be recognized as such. So in a society that doesn't recognize race, we might discount these situations and say they're not racist even though they are. But that's preferable to taking all the other more prevalent types of interactions, one where people are patronizing, mocking, rude, and diagnose all of those as racism as opposed to things they actually are. So yes, there are some shortcomings to not being as aware of race relations and of racism, but I think that there's far more upside to being that way than downside. there's also this notion with tackling of color blindness, because I think at a certain point, I think in the 80s, etc., it was actually accepted. People thought it was the ideal colorblind society, a non-racial society. But I think in more recent times, it's actually become a term that's worthy in some people's eyes of derision. And again, the leader of the opposition said, if you don't see that I'm black, then you don't see me. But I think this is actually a fundamental misunderstanding of what color blindness means. Color blindness does not mean a literal inability to see somebody's race. Of course, that's just, that's bizarre and silly. It's a normative idea that in a colorblind society, whilst we may see people's skin color, we don't actually then infer any other attributes to them because of their skin color. So just because I can see that you're white, I don't assume necessarily that you enjoy some kind of, I don't assume you are of a particular economic status. I don't assume where you live. I don't assume your political inclination. I don't assume things about you before I get to know you. And similarly, just because you're a black person, I don't assume your political inclinations, your level of intelligence. I don't infer attributes to you on the basis of the color of your skin. That's what I think is what color blindness means. Not a literal inability to see people. And again, some people say, well, South Africa isn't that society at the moment, so isn't doing away with race naive because people do see race. And again, it's important to bear in mind that color blindness and non-racialism are normative ideas. In other words, we're talking about the kind of society we would like to see, and then to discuss the ways in which we can reach and achieve that society. These are not descriptive ideals. In other words, they don't describe how society currently is. They're normative principles by which we would like to live by and achieve. Again, in terms of achieving political or social stability, there's this idea that race-based policy is important so people have role models in society. Again, this feeds into the same kind of race essentialist argument that we need to see our colored selves reflected in society in order to feel like we belong. And that, again, has some very detrimental, obviously, consequences. Personally, myself, some of the thinkers that I closely identify with include Christopher Hitchens, Schumpeter, A.C. Grayling, etc. And none of these people happen to share either my sex or what I suppose would be called my race. Of course, I have later in life, these were kind of the earlier thinkers that I was exposed to that fundamentally shaped my worldview and the ideas that I held. There are others who so happen to be black who do as well. There's Kwame Appiah, there's Neville Alexander, Thomas Sowell, who are all thinkers, I think, of the similar kind of liberal vein that I subscribe to. But my liberal ideas were not bolstered suddenly by finding out that, there's by happy chance, there's actually also black liberals who reject the idea of race. I would quite happily have supported the idea of not using race had every single thinker happened to be a white male. So I think it's quite dangerous to ascribe people to ideas and say there are black ideas and white ideas. And if you share the same race as somebody, you have to prescribe the same ideals that they hold, which is essentially what the narrative of race essentialism prescribes. The third ideal, maybe just to recap, because it can be useful in these longer talks, we said that the first ideal that would exist in a society without race is a meritocracy, so a country in which the value of achievement is highly valued, and we discussed the ways in which race might undermine the idea of merit. Then secondly, we explored the idea of how a society without race might be a society in which there's far more social stability. And we've looked at the many ways in which race-based policy, by discounting merit, by engaging in race essentialism, etc., undermines the idea or the possibility of a society that has more socially stable relations. So thirdly, I'd now like to explore the idea that in a society in which race doesn't operate in policy, there'd actually be far better implementation of economic redress and economic progress. So it's worth in this era starting off by saying that it was quite obvious to policymakers in the late 90s that just because Africa kind of had political emancipation, this wasn't necessarily going to lead to economic participation by the majority. So there was kind of this impetus or push to have more interventionist policies to correct what many people saw as kind of the skewed patterns of economic growth, the skewed patterns of economic wealth and ownership in the country. And so one of the arguments that is advanced in favor of race-based policy is this idea that apartheid was based on race, and therefore a solution to these problems must also then be based on race. But it's not actually immediately clear why the cause of a particular problem is necessarily relevant to its particular solution. And you can look to a variety of fields where this might be the case. Somebody who shows up at a hospital who might look like they've been beaten up, has blunt force trauma. It's typically not necessary to know the cause of it to be able to treat it. In fact, in some situations, that person may not be able to speak, and yet that doesn't prevent the ability of those in the medical profession to be able to treat the particular symptoms that person is presenting with. And we see around the world as well, there are many countries that have the same symptoms. So there are people who might have, where there was a poor education system, where a country had spatial inequalities to address, etc. All these range of socioeconomic issues, none of which was the cause particularly relevant in order to design policies to eradicate them. And I think this is important because often when you do draw from case studies internationally and say, well, this country managed to turn itself around in a relatively short period of time, people will make the argument, yes, well, they were able to do so, but they don't have a history of apartheid. But again, people don't make the argument why it is easier to turn around a country economically if its history was one of, let's say, civil war or genocide, and why a history of civil war or genocide is necessarily easier to overcome than a history of apartheid. So I'm not convinced that the cause of our socioeconomic problems makes resolving them much more difficult than countries whose cause of their socioeconomic problems could have been, as I say, civil war, genocide, and other events that we might not necessarily have shared. Another argument is that today's inequalities can be traced back to apartheid. Of course, this becomes less and less true the further away from apartheid we actually move. And again, there are several countries that one could draw from that illustrate that 25 years is enough time to turn around an education system, to turn around housing policy, and yet by various benchmarks, one could reach the conclusion that South Africa, in fact, has not reached the potential that it could have reached in those 25 years. And indeed, it will also be true there are people who have been born after apartheid whose experience of life in South Africa is directly linked to the shortcomings, the poor governance of the democratic administration, and that their inferior education, their exposure to poorly functioning municipalities run by incompetent cadres is directly linked to the present government and has increasingly, as more and more time goes on, less and less to do with the shortcomings of the apartheid state. Lastly, a minor but I suppose issue worth pointing out is that in some ways also the idea that it is necessary to compensate for past wrongs is made weaker by the fact that we can't actually probably ever return or compensate for what happened. And there are some people who recognize this, that of course none of these redress policies are in a way actually compensation for the past. You can't actually make up or return people to their original position or to the counterfactual position they would have been in had race not occurred. And because this is the case, there are those who make an argument for present injustice, so who say, well, actually, the purpose of race-based policies is not to tackle anything necessarily that happened in the past, but the reason we must still have race-based policies is for continuing racial prejudice that's exhibited in interactions, but particularly for ongoing race-based prejudice that people can observe in institutions that they feel is much more systemic. Quite a powerful answer, I think, to present injustice, however, is the fact that whilst there might be, and of course it's worth pointing out that this idea of prejudice and ongoing racism is mostly assigned to the dominant racial group in society. So to assume that there's actually ongoing white racism specifically, and that's the reason why race-based policies and institutions and in areas of employment is necessary, because were it not for these policies, even competent black individuals might not be appointed or brought in particular economic deals, if you're talking about BE, because there's persisting racial prejudice. But what's often discounted is, in fact, the other phenomena which sociologists have looked at of actually white South Africans who feel a great deal of guilt for what happened in the past. So actually, there are a great many people who overcompensate in hiring practices and in other interactions, and not the reverse. So you do have people who are prejudiced, but you also have people who actually are far more likely to, because of their guilt, overcompensate in the other direction. The other problem that arises, that might be a slightly minor one, but the other problem also with accounting for present injustice is this idea of hierarchies of disadvantage. So there's a little bit less research, in my opinion, in South Africa of these other areas of disadvantage, and there's far more material from particularly the United States. But it's worth giving an example of, and that's the idea that the reason why race is seen as being so particularly pernicious is because the circumstance of birth. So it's seen as being unfair because it's not really a disadvantage that arises out of any wrongdoing of that individual. But actually, there are many circumstances of birth that might disadvantage people. Their weight, their height, their accent, their their nationality, where they come from an urban or rural area. And yet many of these other ways in which disadvantage might operate, especially in the workplace, are often discounted. And again, it's not immediately clear why race should essentially trump these other areas of disadvantage. And particularly if we look at height, won't go through all of them. Particularly if we look at height, sometimes the distinction is actually quite large, and especially, like, let's say in political appointments, in which the study has most often been done, where you look at the height differentials of those who are in leadership positions and those who aren't, and you start to say there seems to be some kind of innate preference for individuals who are taller than those who are shorter. I mean, I understand because we don't normally think of these other areas of disadvantage that we might readily dismiss them and kind of think it's laughable. But the more you think about it, accent also plays a huge deal in the workplace. People who don't speak in a way that is familiar to those who are the majority in the workplace often are thought of as being intellectually inferior. And this operates across the color line. It's not a particularly black issue. So there are many, for example, Afrikaans speakers who might be white, if they might be in a predominantly English-speaking environment, in which their heavy and thick Afrikaans accent might be a cause of derision or laughter in the workplace and them not being taken seriously. So it's worth thinking about the fact that whilst circumstances rather disadvantaged based on the circumstance of birth is something that we should be wary of, these kind of race differentiators aren't the only ways in which people can be disadvantaged. And how do we establish this hierarchy of disadvantage in policy? Lastly, I think before we get into questions, because I would like to ensure that we have time for that, is to talk about this idea of voluntary group membership. Because I think also if we're talking about a society in which race no longer operates in policy, it would be a society in which there's far more voluntary group membership. Now, this really is a response to, I suppose, usually a retort that's given to liberals or those who value the idea of the individual, that it's unrealistic because many people in society actually value groups, and isn't removing this idea of racial identity, robbing the very number of people who actually enjoy some kind of group identity. So it's important to note that, in fact, I think liberals would definitely support groups. In fact, many groups are the highest expression of individual choice. But there are certain types of groups that give rise to freedom and certain types of groups that undermine it. And certainly racial groups are the kind of group that undermine freedom because, one, you're not free to join a racial group. You are kind of assigned to it. You're not free to leave. And even once you're part of that group, you play no part usually in determining the rules of the game or the rules of that particular group. There's usually some self-assigned, and we see them all the time, organizations that claim to speak on behalf of people who are of a particular race and who punch above their weight in society in doing so. So these kind of groups in which there's actually no voluntary association are fundamentally a threat to people's freedoms. I said lastly, but I think I should actually end off on this idea of competitive diversity. And that's an important one because it's often also used as a scapegoat. So people will say that actually what we are advocating for is not some kind of harsh quota or demographic representative system. We actually just want society to be diverse, to be broadly reflective of people in society. But this idea of diversity is actually quite often a cop-out. And I'll explain to you why. Firstly, racial diversity should generally not be accepted. Well, firstly, of course, the idea of race itself is flawed, and it's actually, a construct with a very weak scientific basis, as we initially established. But aside from the idea of race itself being flawed, the other reasons for racial diversity being flawed is that actually it ends up being the only kind of diversity that is valued by institutions. So institutions who claim to value diversity typically do not track the religious diversity, the political, ideological diversity of the institutions, maybe the geographic diversity. They only ever track really racial diversity. So that doesn't tell me that institutions or companies value diversity in and of itself, value a kind of diversity of ideas, of contributions. It's really just a term that's been used to mask the fact that we are actually trying to engineer a demographically representative society. If there was a true commitment to the idea of diversity, we would be in fact measuring all sorts of types, all types of diversity across many different areas, and that is definitely not what happens. Secondly, even though sometimes diversity is spoken of in a non-numerical sense, there is often actually a numerical conception behind it, because people talk about political parties not being diverse enough or institutions not being diverse enough. And the moment you say something needs to be more diverse or is not diverse enough, you immediately imply there's some kind of benchmark according to which the institution is being judged. And if that's the case, then you definitely then are entering a numbers game, a quotas game, where you're saying that this institution, and usually that benchmark is the demographics of the country. So usually it is only institutions in which there seems to be an overrepresentation, if you want to call it that, of white South Africans or an underrepresentation of black South Africans that are called not diverse enough. So in fact, there is always a quota, even when you talk about diversity, and that quota is the demographics of the country. And until it's reached, people will talk about, there being a lack of diversity. So how do we overcome this? I mean, what do we do? Some of these problems seem largely intractable. The thing is, well, it's not easy, but I think we need to begin firstly by being staunch advocates of non-racialism. And by that I mean non-racialism now. There's another kind of non-racialism that sometimes people talk about, which is we need to be actually racialized now. We need race now in order to get rid of race in the future, which makes no sense. It's kind of this argument that we need to use race in order to erase the legacies of apartheid without recognizing that racial classification is itself a legacy of apartheid. So if we are going to use race to remove the other legacies of apartheid, what in the end or in the end game will we finally use to eradicate this last legacy of apartheid, which is racial classification? So I think it makes sense. The only way to actually remove race from society is to immediately remove it from policy. Does it mean that if we remove race from all policies, that race or race consciousness will immediately evaporate in society? Of course not. The racial myth might persist for decades, for hundreds of years to come. And I don't mean to offend anyone, but just like there are religious myths, there can also be a racial myth. But governments don't typically include religious myths in their policies. So you will find nothing about any religious orientation necessarily reflected in public policy. So firstly, that's what we're saying, is that even though the myth of race, this false idea of race, may continue to persist in society, it doesn't need to find expression, in fact, in politics or in the policies that governments implement. Secondly, if we can't hope for legislators or policymakers to in fact intervene and do anything, the other measure is to stop acquiescing to be a part of the system. So race-based policies rely to a great extent on each of us, everyone in this room, actually agreeing to take part. We fill in a form, and like drones or zombies, we actually fill in our race and we comply with the system and we allow it to proceed. Because the system is based on this idea that, well, there's nothing wrong with it. It's different to apartheid because it's self-classification. But that's actually false. It's a farce. This system is not based on self-classification. I don't yet have proof of that, but I know that if a business owner who everyone else in society, let's say, identified as white, were to create a job, a business, and identify him or herself as black, people would definitely take issue with that, and I hope that we do have some kind of case law that might confront or put the courts in the uncomfortable position of having to tell somebody who's identified as black that they are not black, and somehow come up with a kind of test or definition for this. But I think it would blow the whole system wide open, because it would reveal that in many circumstances it is not based on self-classification. There is a kind of official, we are still using this old notions of these different racial categories and racial classifications, because under a true system of self-classification, nobody can misclassify. There is no such thing as misrepresenting your race if there's true self-classification, because whatever you say you are is in fact correct. The only way somebody can disagree with you is to refer to a more official taxonomy that actually is not what you've necessarily assigned yourself. So I think those really are the two ways, is that hopefully we might have an about turn in legislation that removes race from policy, but I don't see that happening. But the other way, I think, is to actually undermine the system itself, which only operates because we agree to it. It can only operate because there are willing people in every workplace, in every institution, who abide by this particular system. So a solution is to either not classify yourself, but in cases where this is impossible, I don't know, in some official documentation, you might have to identify your race, to misclassify yourself. In other words, to classify yourself as the race that perhaps society or others would not classify you as. And I think this is an important step to undermining race-based policy in general. And I think this has definitely gained impetus, this conversation, in recent times, because I think it used to be the case that people saw race-based policy as a kind of necessary evil. There used to be a sense that even those who implemented race-based policy were aware that it was some kind of temporary measure, that yes, it's not ideal, but in the future we're all heading towards or value some kind of non-racial society. But I think now, more and more, there are people who actually buy into the idea of race essentialism, where a non-racial society is no longer the end. In fact, race is the end. People are retreating back into their lagers. There's far more expressions of black pride as opposed to saying race doesn't exist. And it's corollary, obviously, on the other extreme, those who arise in a kind of more right-wing white supremacy as well. And I think that the only way to really defeat these ideas, whether it's black nationalism or white nationalism, is to actually be a lot more vigilant than we have been about the way in which these kind of flawed racial ideas pervade society, and to really act now. Thank you.
So guys, we're going to take some questions.
So you spoke about diversity, right? And I mean, I don't know if I missed something, but are you suggesting that we completely scrap striving towards diversity, or are you asking us to rethink diversity by considering religion, sex, race, etc.? Because I mean, there's no doubt that there's a lot of utility for diversity, so I just want some clarification on that.
So on the concept of diversity, I think it's definitely valuable, but I think institutions, and I talk about whether they're private sector or public institutions, can be a lot more explicit about the kind of diversity that's important in that institution. It would be ridiculous to think that all types of diversity matter equally in every single scenario. There might be a case where you actually want geographic diversity because for whatever you're working on, it will be useful to have rural experiences, urban experiences, I don't know, a different scenario in which you might want ideological diversity. All I'm saying is that you cannot ascribe any of those other types of diversity to race. So you can't say just because we've selected people of different races that we've achieved necessarily diversity of ideas or values, because you could have selected people who, let's say it was diverse in educational background that you really value. It is possible to select people of different races who have the same educational background. So you actually haven't achieved the true kind of diversity that you had in mind. And I'm saying that racial diversity in of its own is actually is futile, because it tells you nothing about that person's ideas, their beliefs, their political inclinations, their socioeconomic income. It's really a kind of valueless marker of, in many ways, of diversity. So I think we can be more explicit, and I also wouldn't codify it. So whatever type of diversity a particular institution seeks is not something for the government to determine and say, you will have religious diversity in your organization, or you will have ideological diversity in your organization. Diversity will, in any case, if we believe and can see that society is diverse, diversity in any case will arise by free people making free choices, and that's the kind of diversity that will arise. What I didn't mention in the speech is that there's often this idea of a kind of counterfactual universe where if apartheid hadn't happened, every microcosm in society would directly reflect the demographics of the country. But I don't know why is that so? Why do we think that if apartheid never occurred, in the industry of engineering would demographically reflect the population of the country. The medical profession would demographically reflect the population of the country. The lawyers everywhere. I mean, this would be some kind of fantastical scientific. How would this happen? It's just it's a bizarre counterfactual reality to kind of think would have occurred had it not been for apartheid. So, firstly, I think it's an inaccurate counterfactual, but also secondly, I don't think it's an ideal that we should strive towards, because if we are committed to the idea of freedom of choice, and I mean choice is enshrined in our constitution, I think we broadly all believe that people should be able to make their own choices. Everyone exercising their choice, I don't think results in the demographics of the country and reflecting the demographics of the country. So even if we achieve a society where everyone has broadly an equal level of education and can make the kind of job and employment choices that they want to make, I don't think there's any reason to suppose that we'll all be scattered in a way that reflects the country's demographics. In a country where most people are educated, I don't know, who knows, maybe most black people choose to be doctors and computer scientists, and there'll be hardly any black people who choose to be lawyers because they're all overrepresented in the computer science and medical professions. But so what? If they had the ability to become a computer scientist, they are just choosing to explore something else. So I think what we need to focus on is really ensuring equality of opportunity, that people have a good solid foundation to be able to exercise those choices. But what the outcome is, we shouldn't fiddle with that.
Either way, my voice will be highly projected, I hope. So thank you so much for that. I arrived a bit late. Mine is not so much of a question, because you've quite eloquently articulated the fundamental basis of the racial theory, like sociologically speaking. You unpack the historical context and how we got to interpret the society as we do, as black and white, colored, Indian, whatsoever. But my concern with the lenses through which you interpret race and how the society has constructed its sense of operation, like for example the structuration theory of Gibbons, how the industry and all other spaces through which we function as humans do things, is that to me it seems as though we're moving towards the space where we're somehow denying the currently existing issues that may have triggered because of the socially embedded constructs of racism. My first physically identifiable traits when I enter a space is that I'm a black woman, brown-skinned black woman. That is almost undeniable, right? I enter before you hear me speak, before you understand what I stand for, my association of any other kind. The fact is that physically speaking, I am a brown-skinned woman, okay? And because of that collective identity that you've unpacked on, which was very interesting for me, they are almost an automatic preconceived notions that are mostly associated with the fact that I am a physically identifiable black, brown-skinned woman. So for me, individuality then is a question of self. It's not so much a question of a structural and a systematic nature of operations, okay? So it seems as though we denying the fact that 76% of this country's population is still, I won't say denied or not permitted or doesn't have access. Unfortunately speaking, when we are living in South Africa, this is a beautiful utopia that we all dream of, a non-racial, non-sexist society. But the reality is that we are in a place where brown-skinned people still don't have that much access to resources, not because of race, but because of how socially and historically speaking these things have been constructed. Yes, I'm very mindful of that. It's a long story because I'm a sociologist myself, but I hear your perspectives, and you beautifully stated the historical context and the lenses through which the society has used racial essentialism and so on, but I'm still a little bit perplexed in terms of how do we ensure that we don't deny the current realities that are highly associated with the racial construction of a racial norm.
So I agree that there are consequences as a result of race, right? So I guess what I'm trying to say is that race itself is a myth, but the things that have been done based on that myth are real. So just like any religion can be a myth, but if people behave in such a way as to make that religious myth real, there can be consequences out of acting on that false belief, if that makes sense. So I very much agree that race has very real social consequences, despite it being based on this myth. So the way to address it is first to recognize there's a difference between what is descriptive and what is normative. So a lot of the time when I speak about colorblindness and non-racialism, it's not descriptive. I'm not suggesting that people right now everyone is colorblind, that Africa is completely non-racial, that people do not enter space or situations in which they deeply feel that the fact that they belong to, a certain racial group. All of that is real. I talk about colorblindness and non-racialism in a normative sense, that is what we are trying to achieve. And if that is the goal, what do we do based on that being our goal? So it's not how things currently are, but that's our goal. And it's saying that I don't think you can reach a non-racial goal. So you can't use race to dismantle race. I don't see how that makes sense. You cannot use a legacy of apartheid to dismantle other legacies of apartheid. Because the argument is often that we need to use race to dismantle the legacy of apartheid. But race is itself a legacy of apartheid. So what final instrument then will we use to take down this legacy of apartheid? So I think it has to start from the basis of looking at race as non-racialism as a normative principle. So to not say that we are currently, because I think people bind, and say this, that the moment somebody talks about the non-racialism or colorblindness, they say, but how can you say this? Look at all these examples. And I think that we need to begin by saying this is a normative issue. We're saying what kind of society do we want to live in? And I think that in itself can be controversial because for me, what's actually made this even more profound and important issue to talk about today is that in some ways in the past, one could feel, I wouldn't say comfortable, but you could feel like almost resigned to race being used. You could say, okay, fine, I hate race being used, but it's being used, at least those who use it don't actually like it. The idea was that we don't like racial classification, but it's kind of like this necessity, that we need for now. But I fear that increasingly that's no longer the case. There's increasingly a language now in which actually race identity is the goal. Like people aren't now saying, we don't like these racial identities, but they're kind of this necessary evil for now. There are people now proudly claiming their racial identities, black pride, black excellence. Obviously, there's also on the other side what's always existed, fringe, just as there's always been these groups who are white supremacists, etc. But I don't think you counter white supremacism with feelings of black excellence and black pride either. I don't think that's the ideal anymore as a society in which race doesn't exist. In fact, I think people are trying to reestablish their racial boundaries and racial turf. And I'm not getting into broader conversations, but it's precisely why I also disagree with this idea of cultural appropriation. There's suddenly now like black ideas and black way of dress and black values and black customs. And I'm like, no, when that was never supposed to be the goal. So I think, look, if we're talking about different goals, then of course we will differ. If I'm having a conversation with somebody who actually believes in racial pride and there should be white pride and black pride, then yes, we don't even have like a common premise to begin. But if I'm addressing people who share in the normative goal of a non-racial society, then we can engage and say, well, is race-based policies the best way to reach a non-racial solution? I don't think it is.
Madam, thank you very much, first of all, for your speech, your lecture. My name is James. I found the point that you made about individuals in society not necessarily reflecting upon genocides and civil wars and such things when talking about areas such as economic development. And one of the biggest arguments I hear when individuals talk about quotas and black economic empowerment, affirmative action, such things in businesses is that in order to ensure economic development and economic equality, we need such systems in place. And while, I mean no disrespect by this at all, while the point of them not discussing things such as civil war and genocide and development still occurring under those circumstances, that's a good point. I'm not sure that would be an entirely rigid and convincing argument to make to such individuals. Could you, by any chance, inform me or assist me in understanding, if we do have an argument or a discussion about black economic empowerment and such quota systems and so forth, are such policies inherently destructive or inefficient when looking at economic development as a whole and economic progress?
So, oh, sorry, are you?
No.
Yeah.
Is there factual evidence to back such an argument up?
Yeah. So firstly, it's important to kind of narrow the discussion to the fact that we're talking really about race operating in these policies. And I think it's often a kind of logical flaw in the argument to accuse those who don't want race and redress policies of not wanting redress. That's not the case. We're not arguing about the merits of redress. We're arguing about the means and how to effectively carry that out. So, and I think that's just really the simple answer, is that, of course, you need to have policies in place that will address things like educational inequalities, spatial inequalities, all sorts of disadvantages that people experience. But those, you can have targeted policies in those particular areas. I mean, I've never been convinced you need an overarching policy like BEE. But I mean, obviously, you'll always have an education policy, a healthcare policy to address the disparities in healthcare. You might have spatial policies that look at how people access, physical mobility, how people are able to access areas of work, who live in far-flung areas. So there are a range of targeted and specific policies that you will need to design in order to obviously give people this ability to compete on an equal and level playing field. But the question is, we're discussing, what is the best means of carrying out those policies, or who should the beneficiaries be rather than where the policies themselves should exist. So the policies should exist, but the beneficiary should be anyone who suffers that particular kind of disadvantage. It shouldn't just be that the beneficiaries are black people. And it's also, I think, worth pointing out that, if we recognize that the majority of disadvantaged people in this country are also black, then actually people should have no problem in doing away with race, because in any case, any policy targeted at disadvantage, so if we have a policy targeted at educational disadvantage or healthcare disadvantage or any kind of disadvantage, the majority of the beneficiaries will be black. You've just said yourself that the majority of disadvantaged people are black. Therefore, the majority of recipients of policies based on disadvantage will also be black. So I feel like for people to really oppose disadvantage-based policies, they would need to be able to show that a policy based on disadvantage would result in predominantly white beneficiaries. I mean, I don't know how they will square that circle, but that's effectively the argument you need to make in order to be opposed to disadvantage-based policies. So that's what I think most people are advocating for, is that we actually focus on the areas of disadvantage themselves, and we can remove race from the equation.
You quite rightfully addressed the fact that, you touched on the fact that race is a myth, and you said that, however, the consequences of race
are there and now real. I would like for us to actually delve deeper in that. As per such, looking at the preamble of the Constitution, it actually mandates us to actually undo the injustices of the past. So the current government has a positive duty to undo the injustices of the past. So looking at that positive duty, we now see that whomever is in the legislature or the executive has that mandate, regardless of what objectives they write, they have that mandate to actually undo those injustices. So now looking at the consequences of those injustices, first of all, we look at deprived opportunity, we look at deprived access, we look at inadequate service delivery in general. So now when looking at that, and when coming to terms with that, we now see that there is a need for the government to put in positive steps to actually undo the effects or the consequences of those race-based policies. So when we now turn a blind eye to the fact that people are of a certain race, we now have to pose in the question as to what do we use to actually ensure that we redress those particular effects of those race-based policies. Because I firmly believe that in order for you to actually deal with a problem, you need to diagnose it first. You need to find where the roots are of the problem. And as per such, that is the only way we can move on forward to actually finding the solution. For me, the problem is the fact that the apartheid system in itself was socially constructed with the sole objective of dehumanizing Black people, dehumanizing people of color. So with that said, we the current in the current constitutional dispensation, we have that duty to pull them back up because they have been disempowered. So not acknowledging them or saying that they were never classified as persons of color in the first place is now putting them as a disadvantage, because now how do we classify them? How do we pull them up? And pulling them up is pulling them up as a collective, acknowledging section 36 of the section 36 of the Black Administrative Act, which actually acknowledges that Black people are communal in historically, have always been communal and will always continue to be communal, and actually goes in further and stipulates that we have the freedom of religion, belief, and opinion, and we have that right to have a sense of culture, a sense of belonging. So I think the question I would like to pose to you is then, what do you deem as a valuable solution? Secondly, the whole system, you spoke of a whole hierarchy of disadvantaged. I think we need to dissect that. The hierarchy, policies were never implemented to push out people who are above a certain weight. Policies were never implemented to push out people who are above a certain height. Those, yes, I agree, are socially constructed, but were never entertained at one point historically by people who are actually in authority, legitimately in authority. So we need to be very wary of comparing policies that were implemented with the sole intention of disempowering people with social norms that have never been legitimately approved by persons who are in legitimate power. So I think we need to delve deeper into that point as well.
Does mandate us to do something about the injustice of the past, but it doesn't prescribe the manner in which that needs to be done. So it's a kind of false argument to say that to be opposed to race-based policy is opposed to redress. We're not opposed to redress, we're opposed to the means of redress. So it's not about opposition to redress, but rather how it should be carried out. So that's the first thing to say, that not using race-based policy doesn't contravene any constitutional stipulation. You can have other policies that you could argue meet those ends without using race. So that's how you meet that kind of constitutional imperative, and one of the ways in which you could meet that. And again, here I don't want to be prescriptive, because sometimes if you state a problem and analyze why something's a problem, and then you propose a solution, people will tear down the solution and say, well, because your solution is wrong, your argument about the problems are wrong. And that's not necessarily the case. So I will suggest some solutions. I just want to dissuade people from saying just because you're not convinced by the solution, that means race-based policy works. That doesn't actually follow. You can say, yes, that is a problem and you're right about the problems, but those are the wrong solutions and here are maybe some other alternatives that I haven't expressed. So that's important to bear in mind. But some of the solutions that can be put in place are ones that would fall within the domain of equal opportunity kind of policies, which treats people on the basis of any particular disadvantage. So if you look at race, it's really mostly a proxy in every example of some other kind of disadvantage. So let's say in the university context, you use race really to try and proxy people who might have had educational disadvantages and therefore can't, maybe one would argue, fairly compete against those with better educational opportunities. So you could develop a means kind of system or disadvantage system in each case to assess what kind of disadvantage will place somebody at a disadvantage in terms of being selected for this particular institution. The kind of disadvantage that will have an effect won't be the same for every scenario. So in the case of education, you might be more interested particularly in educational disadvantages and how that takes place. In other scenarios, you might be trying to look at different kinds of disadvantage. But what is true, and what proponents of race, in my mind, or at least I haven't come across someone who can adequately answer this, what they've failed to answer is, if you so strongly make the argument that the majority of people who are disadvantaged in a manner of ways in South Africa are black, and I concede that, why do you not think that a policy based on disadvantage will then benefit the majority of people who are disadvantaged, which is black South Africans? I mean, people who argue that the majority of disadvantaged people are black should have no problem with with policies based on disadvantage, because you've just articulated the majority of disadvantaged people are black. You could only be opposed to that policy if you perhaps believe that a policy based on disadvantage would end up in fact benefiting people who are not black. So white South Africans would be the primary beneficiaries of a policy based on disadvantage, but I'm not quite sure how you square that circle. That makes no sense to me. So I think it makes sense that you can remove race-based policy by coming up with a policy framework that uses the actual means of disadvantage to identify beneficiaries. And bear in mind that this system doesn't need to be perfect, because one of the things that we highlighted was the gross inadequacy of race-based policies and in fact reaching those who most require, who most actually need assistance. That race-based policies work at the level of employment schemes, BE schemes, which actually only benefit those people who aren't the most disadvantaged. They have a certain educational level that's allowed them to get a job and therefore be at the place where they can access further skills training. Or alternatively, they've managed to acquire a certain level of financial capital or political capital in order to be beneficiaries of BE, investment deals, and the like, and therefore transfers of ownership. So let's be under no illusion that race-based policies perfectly address, even to a great significantly address the broad base and people who actually need that assistance. So non-race-based policy isn't competing with some mythical level of 100% accuracy. It's competing with a grossly inadequate system that hasn't benefited those who are in fact disadvantaged. And I think if you can show that the majority of disadvantaged, which we all agree are black, if you have a policy based on disadvantage, the primary beneficiaries will be those people who are disadvantaged, who primarily are black, and precisely those people who need the most assistance, as opposed to the kind of people that are mostly assisted by employment equity and BE legislation. And in terms of the hierarchy of disadvantage, yes, you say quite accurately that policies were never implemented against people of a certain weight, etc. But again, so I concede that. But again, what is the basis for saying that policies should only address disadvantage that is based on bad policy as opposed to any other disadvantage that's based on the circumstance of birth? Why do policies implemented why does disadvantage that arises out of policy trump disadvantage that may arise out of any other kind of social any other kind of social wrong or social harm?
Gwen, you've got a bit of experience in this field, having come out of politics recently. So if politics is downstream from culture, and we've seen, or at least in my perception, that a large amount of political parties have moved down the direction of racialism in the last few years as opposed to non-racialism. Are there any parties currently out there that are still pushing non-racialism? I mean, the DA recently caved on this, and they are supporting BEE and a number of other policies. Is there any hope for the Liberal position in South Africa, represented currently by a party in Parliament?
Well, I mean, firstly, I'd say that I think, political parties change very dramatically. There are some figures who, were in politics myself, only a few months ago, I was a member of Parliament, then resigned, no longer a member of Parliament. So I think things in politics can change very quickly. So I wouldn't ever want to write any party off, because who knows who could, be the candidates, or, who could be within a political party the next few months, the next few years. So it's hard to say in that case. But I think we often are tied to looking at just kind of the main or the big opposition parties. And I think South Africans aren't as pluralistic as perhaps we would like. There's actually usually a whole range of political parties that we don't explore. Something that some people might find interesting, and I mean, in my research of looking at kind of tracing back the politics of race-based policy, is that the IFP, I know surprisingly, but the IFP and COPE have for a long time been very vociferous opponents of race-based policy. Again, it could have been an individual thing. The IFP member that I speak of particularly is Honourable Mbrasini, who passed away. He had cancer. So he was, if you look at the parliamentary committee record, very vociferously and eloquently spoke against race-based policy. But I'm not quite sure if the IFP gave people kind of, the leeway to pursue their own kind of thoughts and arguments in Parliament, and I'm not quite sure to what extent that's reflected in the broader party's policies. Certainly COPE doesn't support race-based policies, but I think any choice in a political party is obviously a collection of policies, right? Although some people might have bottom-line policies, and which for me, race was a bottom-line policy, which is ultimately why I left the DA, because I couldn't be in a party that supported race-based policy. But people have different bottom lines. Somebody else's bottom line might not be race-based policy. It could be the death penalty, and they'll only ever leave a political party if it starts supporting the death penalty, for example. So, so it's hard to say, because I don't think this race-based issue defines in totality what a liberal party is. I think it's an unfortunate concession to illiberalism, but there might be other areas in which, a party still is liberal, even if it's illiberal in this particular area. So I think one has to do a more kind of comprehensive or holistic assessment in that regard.
Thank you so much for the great talk. I'm sorry that I came a little bit later. My name is Luando. I worked with you briefly when you were in the council, but I think it was like 3 months or 2 months. So I won't lie and say that I got to know you better. But obviously, also being involved in the DA, I kind of know you a bit. My question is about liberalism, and also about me identifying as a black man who's proud of being a black man, and also Ongumxhosa, who's a Xhosa person. On the liberalism part, I want to ask, if we look in the Western governances, and we look at what is happening today, we have Trump in America, we've got Brexit in UK, and some other problems. This was preluded by a liberal Democrat or liberal leaning party or whatsoever. And we can come also to context of campus, for example, with fees must fall. These problems of fees must fall were there before when these stakeholders, however, now when the far left comes in and highlights these injustices and highlights these problems, we liberal-leaning people are quickly to jump to say, we need to come up with solutions to this, even though we didn't see at the time when we were governing that the policies we were coming with had discrepancies. For example, in America, we say that the Trump voters, these people are illogical or whatsoever, but why did it had to reach a point where people have to be angry and go to polls and vote for Donald Trump in order for their problems to be dealt with? Same thing on campus. Why did students have to bend down buildings in order to for them to be heard? Stellenbosch University again. Why did black students have to do open Stellenbosch in order for the authorities to understand that Afrikaans as a sole language of instruction was an injustice to it? And then the question I have with that is, are we not doing injustice in We were there in governance before when this thing's happening. However, now we want to say, wait, guys, don't do anything. Let's come in. Let's give you solutions for this problem. Shouldn't we be the ones who are sitting down in order to understand our policies better and their consequences?
Thank you for that question. I mean, on one hand, I'm almost prompted to say, well, I can't answer for every liberal government in the world and why they didn't address, a whole range of issues. But okay, I realize that may be kind of a cop-out. So, look, I think I'll agree with you that, yes, liberalism or liberal ideas have many, things to grapple with and to challenge certain ideas that it's held. And yes, it should do that. I mean, I'd be the last person to say that there's absolutely nothing to challenge. I mean, for example, I think I haven't reached any conclusions, but something that I also think about a great deal is, disparities in earnings. So I by no means think that everyone, for example, should earn an equal wage. I'm quite happy with there to be, income differences. But one must obviously think about, well, is it right when someone is earning, 1,000 times more than their average employee? Have you not been perhaps compensated beyond the level of risk you ever took? And I don't know whether those are just practical considerations or those principled considerations, but I certainly don't think that, that liberalism should be an unthinking or uncritical idea. But when you say, how did we reach this point? Why do students have to burn buildings? They didn't. But I think I'm now going to get diverted into a kind of different conversation, which is perhaps going to be controversial and, not quite so, strictly the focus of this talk. But I don't think that they did. I was quite critical about student vandalism and what they did. They didn't have to do that to be heard. They were being heard. Except that I think increasingly students don't understand the difference between being heard and your ideas being accepted. Just because I hear you doesn't mean now, there seems to be some groups who think that unless they get their way, they are not being heard. That's not what being heard means. I can hear you, consider what you have to say, respond to you and disagree. But then some people say, no, we haven't been heard, and we will protest and burn things and vandalize until the solutions we have on the table are implemented. And I think for me, that's a very different thing to being heard. And I think there are perhaps certain societies and circumstances which justify that kind of behavior. But I think that we live in a largely democratic society with us, there are plenty of institutions in which one can be heard. Actually, was it last year? I can't quite remember. I wrote an article in the Daily Maverick called The Tyranny of the Youth and their constant demands to be heard when they are heard. And this idea, every single section of society could develop their own sectarian interest and demand to be heard. I've been a member of parliament, and if I can say there's one group that is heard, it is young people. There's a youth parliament. They often invite purposely parliamentary committees or try and seek out youth groups if there's a particular issue that affects you. There are SRCs in universities. We talk about youth unemployment. There's literally this overwhelming sense of the youth being heard. But people don't, unless they're getting their way in what they're saying, then they think they're not being heard. And I don't think, and as I've said, that's not what being heard means. There are many other sections of society which are largely disregarded. Take, for example, old people. There was and perhaps it's kind of ageist to call them old as old, but I don't know, I'm not going to be using the right nomenclature, but the point is, people above a certain age have very little voice in South Africa. I won't remember now offhand the particular study or report, but it reveals South Africa is one of the worst places in the world to live if you're above the age of 65. In terms of transport, healthcare, employment rights, basically discarded. Are you 60 years old, no longer fit to work? And that's perfectly allowed by law. You might be still perfectly competent, the best person doing that particular job, but just because you've reached a certain age, you have every legitimate basis to just fire you, and that's not considered unfair discrimination at all. So, I really think the youth must really consider this idea of not being heard. Old people, older people, people above a certain age, I don't know, are really not heard in this country. And I think you can almost develop any sectarian group. You can say, well, people from rural areas are not heard. Why is there a youth parliament? We want a rural people's parliament. Then somebody else stands up and says, why are there's ageism in South Africa? We want a parliament for people over the age of 65. Somebody else will get up and say, so many people, there's a huge crisis of mental depression in this country, and mental depression or mental health care is not sufficiently considered. We want a forum for those, who have some kind of mental illness. You can think of any sectarian interest and lobby on that basis. So I don't see why the youth have a particular reason to be heard above people with another grouping, whether it's based on age, whether mental illness, whether it's youth should be more heard than people from rural areas, and yet there's absolutely no desire to seemingly mobilize around these other points. Anyway, so that's kind of a long-winded way to say I actually think there are plenty of forums, and being heard is not the same as what you have to say being taken into considerations. And I think students didn't have to burn down buildings, they shouldn't have, and those who did should have been charged.
Hi Gwen, thanks for your talk, and sorry to see the back of you at the DA. We had hoped that you'd have some good influence there. Probably an easy question to deal with, but I was having this conversation with my father the other day. He was dealing with a bunch of graduates trying to talk about sort of these unconscious biases that do exist. There's a body of knowledge, and I have no idea where it comes out of, from I suppose an American university sect, where they do these sort of double-blind tests where they're putting whatever it is, some sort of a call it a legal brief, and they're going to pass it between a host of different partners, and they're going to put different names on the top of that brief, and then they're going to see how the differences manifest across sex, across race, whatever may be. So and a whole bunch of these studies seem to be pointing towards some sort of a bias that exists in these places. My departure point is usually a liberal departure point. It usually says let's not go down an affirmative action road, but it is difficult in the face of that sort of evidence to start saying what do we do with that when you're seeing a boss change their mind, or you're seeing a critique, perhaps more or less of a critique coming out based along a gender or a racial line. Like what are you doing with that evidence? Are you entirely discrediting it from the outset because of its source from perhaps a bad science field? Where does that fit in within your reading, would be my question.
I mean, I would certainly, if I'm getting your question correctly, is to say that, you know, there definitely will always need to be policies probably that deal with racism, which is different to saying that race should give people preferential treatment in particular areas. But you can have policies that address racial prejudice, that address racism. So it's not to say that in a society in which you don't have racial preference, that a society that ignores the fact that the myth of race still exists. I mean, it's kind of would be similar to a society in which there are people who, believe in like kind of witches and might be burning women because they believe that there are witches, and so the government can agree that these women are not witches, but they would still need to have a policy to address the false belief of those who do believe they are witches and the actions that they take on the basis of that false belief. So I think that treating race as a myth doesn't mean that you're not going to then have policies that address the myth of race in society, which I think will always remain important. And again, there are many, just maybe to give a further illustration, is that I think there are other areas where we recognize there might be policies to address certain prejudices without giving people preferential treatment. So just now off the top of my head, to think that there might be a workplace that has policies on, being more mindful of people who might belong to the kind of LGBTQ, sorry, I don't know what is the proper designation these days, but so there might be policies that address prejudice towards people who aren't heterosexual, but that's not the same as saying we must have policies in society that give preference to people when they apply for jobs. I mean, as far as I know, there isn't, not being heterosexual doesn't give you any kind of preference when it comes to BE deal or employment, and yet there might be policies to counter prejudice against those people. Similarly, with immigrants, there might be policies to counter xenophobia without there being policies that give immigrants preferential access to jobs and to ownership of business. So definitely the idea of removing race from preferential policies doesn't influence our ability to have policies that tackle racism and racial prejudice wherever we may encounter it.
Hi, I'm Bhavni. So I think why the elderly in South Africa are suffering a lot is because majority of the people in South Africa are firstly black. Okay, and those older generations don't have the power because we didn't deal with the apartheid legacies properly. So what that is because of the corruption and government and all that other stuff. But I think it seems like I don't want to be rude. It seems like you have a little bit of a chip on your shoulder about the race card, right? And then you're saying we should look more towards classism, right? Because BEE actually helps those Black people that have the education, and therefore we should focus more on the impoverished. But here's the issue. If we look at it as, okay, you have a qualification, a postgrad, whatever the case may be, you don't need our support anymore, and therefore if there's a white and Black employee that have the same credentials, it should be fair game. Like, let's pull straws or something, right? But we're forgetting that it's only been 25 years. So that is younger, that's older than me, but that's half my mom's age. So when my mom got her job, she was very lucky. She went into university. I think she was the second person besides her sister to go there, right? But if they had said, you know what, you have a degree, I'm going to give it to this white lady because you have the same qualifications and I just like her more, I think she's a better fit, then this white lady doesn't really have to worry about her grandparents or her mother because they had those opportunities beforehand that we did not have. So my mom, she doesn't just pay for my university career, she also pays my grandmother's electricity bill on both sides of the families. And I know lots of people of color don't just have to deal with their family unit, mom, dad, children. It's mom, dad, children, aunt, uncle, grandmother, mother sort of situation. And also the next thing, that was just a comment. The next thing is race discounts merit. 80% of the population is Black, like Black. Not Indian, that's 2%. Colored people, I think it's 7%. But if you cannot find one Black person that it has the best requirements for that job, you're not looking hard enough, and you're not properly looking for quality. You're looking to say there it's BEE, it's done. That's not how it should work. It should be, I'm trying to find the best possible Black candidate I can, and if you're not looking for that, then that's an ideological issue. So it's not about race trumps merit. It's we need to find a balance. And then once the race is equalized and there's no societal issues and generational issues that we have to worry about, then we can be like, okay, now let's all be colorblind, because it's fine now. But that's not the case right now. Yeah.
I really danced it and said that there's a difference between descriptive and normative. So, yeah, I'm not making the argument that we are currently non-racial or colorblind society. That's a descriptive analysis, and I'm making a normative point about the kind of society we want to get to and what's required to reach that society. So the only basis there that you can argue is say that that's not the society you're heading towards, or it is, but we can achieve it in a different way. You also make the point that older people are Black, and that is why the elderly are marginalized, because most of the elderly...
No, I'm just saying, with the ratio, Black people are the majority from all the generations. So if you're saying...
Yeah, but essentially the marginalization of the elderly is linked to the fact that the majority of the population is Black.
And have less power, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I know many examples to discount that point. The strength of the unions, other institutions which are also predominantly Black and actually do wield quite a fair deal of political power. So I don't think
that's the working class, though. That's not the old people. That have unions.
Okay, it's not a back and forth, but your argument, unless I'm wrong, I mean, you can correct me, I'm just saying you can go back and forth if I'm wrong. Your argument is that the elderly are marginalized because the majority of the population is Black. And I'm saying that as the premise for their Blackness, as the premise for their marginalization, cannot be true, because we see many other institutions of society that wield quite a fair deal of political clout that are compromised primarily by the Black population. So that's the answer there, unless I have it wrong. And then, okay, you said I seem to have a chip on my shoulder. Well, I don't, but I don't need to spend time disproving that. And then you also said if white and Black were equal, we should then pull straws to kind of see who's the best. No, that's actually completely not at all what I'm saying. I'm saying that if you had a scenario in which you had equivalent, let's say, white candidates, you would actually not just pull straws, for example, to see who was the best. You would probably devise a psychometric test, and another kind of evaluation. You would try and find another means in which the other candidate is better. Perhaps you look at their prior experience and say, actually, they've worked for bigger companies and we like that kind of international big corporate exposure. Or, I don't know, you would find a substantive reason for preferring the one candidate over the other. Whereas when you have a white and a Black person where they initially both meet the initial requirements, you are disincentivized from looking any further, because you already from the get-go know your trump card. the trump card is race. So as soon as they both meet minimal criteria, you choose the black candidate. There's no further investigation into what other substantive criteria could the one person perhaps be better than the other person. And so, as I said, what ends up happening in that scenario is that you actually end up choosing candidates who meet minimum qualifications and are also black, as opposed to selecting the very best candidates. It is very unlikely, and again, the experience is mostly anecdotal. Somebody could argue and say, actually, you're wrong, when companies, when there's a black person and a white person of equal, who initially meet minimum qualifications, they engage in all sorts of other ways to truly prove that the black person is the best person for the job. I mean, you can make that argument, and I mean, I'd really be interested to hear it, but I don't think that's the case. The moment where most organizations meet a black person who at least meets minimal criteria, that's sufficient, and then at least, then race is used as a trump card. But you say, well, yes, this should be the case. Race should be used as a trump card because of history, etc. But except you provide no reason as to why. I mean, you just state that as like a value, that yes, race should, black people make up the majority of the population. Race should be, the trump card. But I'm not quite sure. And you say, if you can't find an adequately qualified black person for a role, you're simply not looking hard enough. But why the whole question is this: why should there be this grand social engineering exercise where every microcosm of society must reflect the demographics of the population? Because I'm not saying that black South Africans shouldn't have opportunities. Of course, that would be work against my own self-interest as well. I'm just saying that, so what, let's say, if you found that the majority of black South Africans ended up as, let's say, doctors and in the public service. So meaning that you would find then few black people, let's say, in engineering. Let's say black people, you have so you envision a society in which there's 100% employment. Everyone is employed, but except they're not each represented in every institution, as you say. So there's an over-representation, if you want to use Jimmy Money's words, of black people in the medical profession, and the under-representation of black people in the engineering profession. And I'm saying, what's wrong with that? So what? So that's really the point, is that if you force every single institution to be obsessed with racial bean counting, you're trying to suggest the ideal is the scenario in which every single institution or industry reflects the demographics of the population. I'm saying there's absolutely no reason why that should be the case. There could be 80% of black people in one profession and none in another profession, if that's what you're chosen.
I wasn't really talking about the representation in the company. I was just saying, if we're discussing BEE and how if there's a black candidate and a white candidate, because of the generational inequalities, it would make more sense for the country if it was the black person, because they're supporting more people, usually.
Yes, and I'm saying there's no justification for why that makes more sense.
Simply. Hi, thanks so much for the talk. So maybe I misunderstood you, but it seems like on the argument of race kind of trumps merit, you're kind of taking it from the premise where if like a black person is hired to reach a quota or whatever, is that they will be incompetent, or that the company is compromising its like quality of employees. And I think that in itself kind of recreates a negative stereotype about black professionals in the working sphere. And secondly, you said this whole thing of like kind of transforming the working sector is taken from a punitive measures, and that white people have been, maybe there are a group of white people who have been overcompensating. But I've recently been reading a book by Robert Meister, who speaks about South Africa's transition. And he basically makes the argument that black South Africans or people of color were given reconciliation as justice. And from that, white people merely had to acknowledge that apartheid was wrong, but not give up anything after that. So I would like to ask, like, how can you measure overcompensation? Because I don't think currently, anyone can prove that there has been overcompensation. If anything, I think there's probably been exploitation of like black laborers, particularly like in, the agricultural whatever sector. And secondly, like from the argument you made about, you know, a sickness or sickness and diagnosis doesn't necessarily lead to the solution. But if we look at how, you know, the urban or the industrial sector is populated majority by white individuals, it's because of a social engineering of the color bar that was implemented during apartheid to make sure that it was mostly white people in like proper working jobs where the black population was just for manual labor. So I would agree with my colleague who says it makes sense to make those improvisions that kind of enable black people to access the working space.
So your first point is that, you know, kind of these arguments that I make an assumption that, you know, black people will be incompetent. And I don't think they do. I'm just explaining how when you introduce the criteria of race, you necessarily discount merit. And that's why I gave the two kind of scenarios in which that operates. The first was the more kind of liberal scenario where they talk about two equally qualified candidates. And I think that question has come up a lot tonight. And I've explained why when you have a black and a white person who meets minimum criteria, there's often, if you have race then as a trump card, there's no incentive to look at other substantive measures in which the other person might be better. So it's not because black people are incompetent, just the system is designed in such a way as to not create incentives for hiring the best candidates. It creates an incentive to hire the candidate that meets the minimum criteria. So it's not because black people are inherently stupid, it's just because the system is designed in a way as not to favor excellence.
But then it seems by that argument you're saying that the candidate with the minimum requirements will be black if they get chosen in that system.
No, I'm saying that you will never know because it doesn't encourage you to probe further. So where you have a white and black person that meet the minimum requirements, you don't investigate further to say, okay, aside from the minimum requirements we initially advertised for the job, let's say it was a master's degree in X subject and 5 years experience, and you have two people who both have a master's degree in that subject and 5 years experience. There could be many other ways in which the other person is better besides the ones you initially listed. The other person could have had a world of international experience, and the other person maybe actually, got those 5 experience maybe in a lower level post that didn't give them the experience of the other candidates. So, but because they meet those two initial criteria, and you know that both meet the minimum criteria, and that also that you have to employ black people, you then use at that early stage their race as a trump card. So I don't know if you see what I'm saying, is that they both meet minimum criteria, but because you already have race the trump card from the beginning, there's no incentive to probe into other differences. It may very well be that as you probe, actually the black candidate still does come out on top. They've got a wealth of international experience, they've got X and Y, and actually they are the better candidate. But why not then allow that probe to happen? Why use race to trump and say, well, as long as these minimum criteria are met, you should employ the black person. And actually, I would argue that my conception is the one that actually values and believes in the competence of black people, and people who want to use race as a crutch are the ones who actually somehow doubt that black people are competent enough. Because my argument is, if it is true that there are a wealth of competent black South Africans who can occupy a number of jobs, there's absolutely a merit-based system. They will get that job because they're the most meritorious. That argument makes sense. The only reason to argue that is to say, well, even though there are meritorious black candidates, prejudice will in fact mean that employers, even though the black person is more highly qualified, employers will choose the less qualified person. The reason I doubt that response is the fact that even during apartheid, this again is a huge discussion on its own, it was most of the interest of capital that saw job reservation break down and more black people into the workplace, precisely because even if we were to assume that the majority of employers in South Africa are racist, which I don't believe, but let's assume that the majority are racist, you don't only have to prove that they're racist, you have to prove that they are so racist that their racism trumps their economic interests. That even if a black person would do the job better and therefore be better for their company, they are so racist they would actually want to hire the less qualified white person because that's how racist they are. Their racism will in fact undermine their profit motive, which most people in business have, and they'll actually rather employ a white person who's less qualified.
But that happens all the time, in real life instances where people of color do get undermined, like for the preference of maybe a younger white individual that happens all the time.
Yeah,
because
so
there is racial bias.
Yes, so my point is that it's not racial bias. So again, I would never even deny that there's racism. Obviously, there will always be racism, there will always be racial prejudice. What we're trying to think about is what operates at the largest scale. And I think that economic interests operate at the largest scale. Firstly, well, it's a tiered argument. The first argument is to say that there's no evidence the majority of employers are racist or exhibit racial prejudice. That point would first need to be proved. And the second argument, the argument goes to, even if we give you that first point and we say the majority of employers are racist, you'd also then say the majority are racist, but also the majority are so racist that their racism trumps their economic interests. So it's not to say there aren't cases in which people employ somebody who's less qualified for the job, but we're trying to say that it's unlikely that's happening the majority of instances.
Hi, Gwen. This is, I guess, going to be more of a comment than a question. One of the things I find really absurd about this whole point of, particularly making the point of black excellence. Actually, a year to the day, I posted something about black excellence and saying that I would much rather prefer a normal congratulatory message without anyone mentioning black excellence to me. And I then came to a realization that actually throughout all of my achievements personally, no one has ever attributed that sort of phrase to me, hashtag black excellence. Maybe if I posted a picture of myself graduating or something like that. Then I came to the realization that it's the authenticity and the genuine care that goes into this whole labeling and phrasing it actually does not exist, because it doesn't apply to certain people. For example, if a black person supports the DA, no one would ever say black excellence. So it then goes into those certain areas where you find that it's actually not genuine. And I guess the question I want to ask from that is that seeing that there's a lot of politics also that is at play, and a lot of ideological influence that goes into this whole black excellence thing. And is this battle against it worth fighting? And is it something that, not to say that we are in it to not that it's a game and we're in it to win or anything. Is this worth fighting, seeing that by your own admission it's something that can stick around or will be around for the next few decades, probably even hundreds of years?
Well, I mean, what are you suggesting, that we just give up because it's...
I don't know. I don't suggest we give up, but is there an end to what we're doing?
I mean, I think if you look at, I would say I think there is a point, but of course, in hindsight, I don't know, if 80 years from now we're still saying the same things and it hasn't changed, then I might wish that I'd spent my life differently. I don't know if it'll be worth it when I'm on like my deathbed, and but I do think also we can't underestimate how sometimes turning points aren't always obvious before they happen. So I don't know at what point, for example, people who are fighting against apartheid, it became obvious that the system was absolutely going to be dismantled. It could have, I don't know, maybe even by the late 80s, some were still, kind of despairing and thinking, what is the point of it? So I don't know if you're always like aware of that kind of tipping point, but I think they do happen. And it kind of reminds me as well of, there's this quote, I can't remember who said it to her, but looking at the life of Helen Suzman, and she had spent like 11 years in Parliament as kind of the lone Liberal MP, and she was saying to somebody, I'm tempted to say it was one of the Oppenheimers, but I'm not sure, so let me not say who she was talking to, because I'm not quite sure who she was having this discussion with, but she was just recounting how frustrated and despairing she felt about the idea of liberalism and how hopeless it seemed being the only person in Parliament advocating for these values. And he kind of said back to her that your job is to drip feed liberal ideas into the bloodstream of the body politic. And I think that's exactly what we're doing, is you're just like a constant drip feed. And I don't know at what point it makes a difference, but I can't help believe that at some point it will. And also in a weird way, it's kind of this subversive act, because I do feel that those of us who do share these ideas are in some ways duty bound to speak up, because we also do live in an environment now where if you are of a particular sex or particular race, people think you have no authority to weigh in on certain discussions. So if I felt the need to have these conversations years ago, I feel them more profoundly now, where there are some people who share my ideas, but they feel like they can't speak because they aren't the right race or the right sex or whatever to critique these ideas. And I think in some ways there's tremendous privilege, which I hate, but I can't deny that there is some kind of tremendous privilege in being black and female and being able to critique race-based policy, because no one can argue that I'm doing so sort of in my self-interest, because so I think also it's kind of imperative to speak about it from that perspective.
Thanks. You guys, Gwen has to leave, she has to catch a flight. So unfortunately, that's all for the evening. I would like to thank Gwen. Thank you for joining us this evening, giving her time all the way from Johannesburg. Can we just give her a round of applause? And also, I would like to thank all of you guys for joining us. I'm sure you know that the liberal community in South Africa and also on campus is not that big. So thank you for taking some time out of your schedule to making this event possible and for the